And hello, and my name's Andy Jordan. Here we are in the Strat Chamber, and welcome to part 3 of the Wellington story, or welcome back if you've seen the previous episode. So, a lot of people refer to the Wellington as the Wellington bomber. It had far more roles than just that, but the bomber version is what we're covering today. So, what I'd like to do initially is correct myself. In part 1, I said Vickers aircraft typically started with W. I meant to say V. The Wellesley, Wellington, Windsor and the Warwick, got those in the wrong order, but never mind. They were the W's for the geodetic Wallace. Now, in the last episode 2, where we walked around the Wellington and walked through the Wellington walkthrough, I mentioned a very brave airman whose name I couldn't remember for the life of me, who climbed out the Astrodome to save his aircraft. Now, his name, he was Pilot Sergeant James Allen Ward, or commonly known as Jimmy Ward. He was a New Zealander in 75 Squadron, Royal New Zealand Air Force, and they were on a mission 7th to 8th of July 1941 over Munster, when they were set upon by a Messerschmitt Bf-110. Basically took a lot of cannon fire. Hydraulics were severed, fuel lines were severed in the starboard engine, and the engine caught fire. He very bravely, or rather before he did have to do this, the crew bashed holes in the canvas, tried to use fire extinguishers to put out the flames, all to no avail. Somewhat desperately, so I've heard or read, tried to throw cups of coffee over the fire. What they were trying to do there, I've no idea. But in the end, he popped the Astrodome off. He was going to go out without a parachute, but his fellow crew members persuaded him not to. So they put a rope around him that would normally be used for the lifeboat attachment. Out he climbed with his parachute, punched and kicked holes through the canvas, climbed out onto the wing, carrying the canopy cover, the canvas canopy cover from inside the aircraft, almost got swept off the wing several times, tried to stuff it into the cavity to extinguish the flames. Finally, that blew away, but he'd done a sufficient job to actually fairly well extinguish the fire. And he earned himself for that the nickname the Wellington Wing Walker. He clambered back, got one leg in the Astrodome. Poor guy was so exhausted that one of his crewmates had to get his other leg in and had to put him on the rest bunk for a while to recover. For this, he was awarded the VC, but unfortunately, on the night of September the 14th to 15th, 1941, on a raid over Hamburg, the aircraft was shut up, he was killed. So the poor guy, his parents had to go and collect his VC. So that is the story of Jimmy Ward. Now we have the chart here, the Wellington family bramble bush as I call it. From the prototype Wellington, the Cressy, there was a complete redesign to the Mk1, where basically specification B135 had now come out, which was basically going to be the Warwick. So rather than build 2 separate aircraft, the Wellington was redesigned. The Warwick is just an elongated and widened version. So the bomb load with the deeper belly was now 4,500 pounds. Now this could be the 9 250 pounders or 9 500 pounders. The top speed of the Wellington was in the region of 250 miles an hour, depending on fuel and bomb load. And by now the crew had gone up from the earlier numbers of 4 to 5 to 5 to 6. That was the normal crew numbers. So now what we'll do, we'll cover day to night, the duties, navigation. So after the terrible Battle of Heligoland on 18th December 1939, where it was just carnage, 24 aircraft went out, 2 went back tech, and a further 10 out of the 22 remaining were shot down on a daylight raid. It was decided that the bomber won't always get through. The phrase was the bomber will always get through. So flying in formation, defending each other, this just wasn't working. That was clearly shown on that raid. So now if you're going from daylight raids to night raids, you've now got the problem of navigation. So this is long before even the earliest aircraft radars. So the navigation would basically be dead reckoning. You need to know your wind speeds and directions, side winds, so that was, as we looked in part 2, you could use the flame float to see what way the drift of the sea was going. You could use the stars. Unless it was very clear night, you're not going to see any features on the ground. So that was basically the just dead reckoning, and the average accuracy was somewhere in the region of 7 to 10 miles was regarded as pretty good. Now, a breakthrough in navigation was made in 1942 with the advent of GEE. Now, this basically used radar masts in mainland Britain to send a signal, a parabolic signal, that the bomber would follow. The only problem being was range. Once you're over the horizon, you've lost it. So you could maybe get 250 to 350 miles, depending on the altitude you were flying, and then you were back to dead reckoning again. But however, within that area, or that range, shall I say, it was very accurate. In 1943 came along oboe. This was a similar system, so radar masts, transponders on the aircraft, taking you to your target, but then again, once you left that signal, you're back to dead reckoning until along came H2S. Now this was a groundbreaking revolution. This was airborne radar, so you basically, instead of having a ground-based radar, your radar went with you. So the beauty behind this was the invention of the cavity magnetron. Now you're probably wondering what that is. You've probably got one in your kitchen, but before you tear the place apart, let me tell you, it's in your microwave. So this was basically terrain mapping radar. So as you flew, it's mapping the ground, it's showing you where you are, the features on the ground, and that got you to your target. Now once you got to your target, and your squadron or your group had finished its raid, or were during the raid even, it'd be a good idea to see what you're actually hitting. And this is where a thing called a photo flash bomb came in. Basically 4 foot long-ish, 8-inch diameter. It was dropped through the flare chute. On board one or more of the aircraft on that raid was a camera set to about an 8-second exposure. The bomb was a typical square-ended, usual layout bomb, but with a baffle plate to slow it down. It had a timer. Now the idea was that would drop, it would do an airburst above the ground, and it would create 500 million candle power approximately for 1/5 of a second. When that flash occurred, that would light up to a 5-mile radius, and that would hopefully be timed correctly to the camera being in that exposure range. Now John Rowland, my colleague and friend in the Strat here, and myself, we did look at recreating one of these, but when we saw the chemicals involved, there's one guy on the pyrotechnic site said he messed about with this stuff 20 years ago, if I knew now what I knew then. And we also were a bit wary of getting a knock on the door, so we promptly scrapped that idea. Now as far as bombing goes, it was used for other things as well as bombing, as I described in chapter 2, or episode 2. Nickel raids, so that was be launching out boxes of propaganda leaflets, dropping the frazzles or razzles and deckers, which I described, the little phosphorus incendiaries, onto crops and woodland. It was also used for laying mines, 1,500 pound sea mines, and this was called gardening. The mine was called the vegetable, and the area you were laying the mine in was named either after a fruit or a flower. They were also used from the Mark II onwards for dropping cookies. These were a 4,000 pound high capacity bomb. Basically the idea was to smash off roof tiles. They were followed by boxes of incendiaries. Now these were usually £4, or the ICI version were 1.2 pounds, 1 kilo, and it was basically aluminium powder mixed with iron oxide in an aluminium casing. Sorry, magnesium casing I should have said. The idea being the cookie would fall to the ground, blow roof tiles off, down would come all these incendiaries to set buildings ablaze. Now unfortunately for the poor Wellington Wimpy, the bomber, from the introduction of the short Stirling and the handy page Halifax in 1941 and the Avro Lancaster in 42, it was no longer considered a suitable bomber, so it was relegated to other roles, which we'll cover later. But in the meantime, let's look at the bombing roles that it did perform in. So here you have the Mk1, 181 built and 2 pre-production. Vickers turrets. Now here, on this beautiful picture that we've got here of the Mk1s, this is the Vickers turret. Very distinctive, not a rotating turret like the later Fraser-Nash's. Vickers guns, and it also had a dustbin ventral turret. That was usually FN9 or the FN25, although there are rumours that Vickers turrets were fitted initially, but the Air Ministry didn't like them. So whether they were actually fitted or they weren't is open to speculation. These weren't very good turrets at all. If you swung the guns more than 30 degrees either way, there was a problem with the belts jamming, so that basically the gunner would have to hang them over his arm to stop them jamming up beyond 30 degrees. On this picture here, you see two versions. Astrodome here, and what we call the sunroof. It took us a while to discover what this was, but it's actually, in effect, a dorsal gun position. So you could open up the roof, there'd be a little deflector, and you could have a handheld machine gun to take on enemy fighters from that position. You'll also notice here, DTD 230. That's basically stenciled on the engine nacelle. Department of Technological Development, 230 being the fuel grade. Now this is 87 octane petrol. How it burned, I've no idea. So that is even worse quality than what we used to have as 2-star petrol, for those that remember it. The first Mk1 flew on December the 23rd, 1937. They were intended to have the Pegasus, the 9-cylinder 28.7 litre single row radial, Pegasus 18, but these weren't ready in time. So the prototype flew with a Pegasus 20. It was involved in an accident. While it was being repaired, the 18s became available, and it was fitted with the Pegasus 18 engine as an alternative. We can now move on to the Mk1A. The Vickers turrets, they weren't favoured at all by the Air Ministry, and they basically wanted interchangeability between all aircraft, so Fraser-Nash-Thompson turrets were preferred, which we saw on our Robert. So the Mk1 was fitted with the Fraser-Nash-Thompson FN25 twin gun nose and tail turrets. The dustbins were still being used. I believe at the time they were by now the FN25. There were 187 built here at Weybridge. A few modifications though. The undercarriage was enlarged. Because of this, it had to be shifted. And also, the undercarriage doors had to be cut away because the wheel would no longer fit in the engine nacelle. The 1A, like the Mk1, was fitted with the Bristol Pegasus 18 engine, which we saw an example of on our Robert, which is, in fact, a 1A. Now, here we have the Mk1B. As I've written here, no records may have been built, but redesignated Mk1A. It was basically just an improvement on the Mk1A in a few subtle ways. The beam guns, which were placed in the windows here, were repositioned a lot further aft. The ventral turrets were being deleted, but as I say, that would probably been redesignated back to a 1A, and no records exist of that, but there is mention of it. So on to the Mk1C. 2,685 built, although I haven't written that here. Again, the Pegasus engines, but it was built to Mk2 specification. But as I said, still using the Pegasus engines. The difference between the 1C, the 1A, if you're not going to run around with a pressure gauge or multimeter, you're not going to really tell. The electrics were improved, they were upgraded to 24 volt. Hydraulics were uprated to 1,000 pounds a square inch, 300 PSI for the turrets, with what I believe was a VCS system. And another difference from the Mk1C to the 1A, the Vickers waist guns were deleted, changed to Brownings, and moved even further aft. So the Mk2. Prototype, Merlin engines, Merlin 10s. One built, and then 400 production. Now the problem between a Merlin and a radial engine, which as we'll look at in a while, the Merlin engine pushes the centre of gravity a lot further forward. So this created a bit of an imbalance problem. So the undercarriage had to be shifted forward to counteract that. and also it created a problem with the centre of gravity in flight. So basically counterbalance weights were put in the tail section. So the prototype Mark II first flew on the 3rd of March 1939. L4250 was its registration, and when we touch on the sore point of the Mark 7s, we'll come back to that. Here we have the Mark III. 2 prototypes built, 1,517 production built. First flown, and this was by the way L4251, first flown May the 19th, 1939. Production 1941, went into service in 1942. Difference between the 3 and the 1 and 2 prior to it went to the most common engine used on the Wellingtons, the Bristol Hercules. 14 cylinders, sleeve valve, twin row, radial. Very, very nice engine, very sturdy engine, and we'll go and have a look at one of those in a while. We just so happen to have one a few yards behind me. A real distinct difference between the Mark III's and its predecessors was the introduction of the 4-gun rear turret. It was intended to be the Fraser-Nash FN20A. These weren't ready in time, so the earlier versions were built with the FN4, still with 4 303 Brownings in the rear turret. They also, at last, had self-sealing fuel tanks. They had de-icing equipment. They had windscreen wipers. From this point onwards, this became mandatory on all bombers in British operation. And it also had balloon wire cutters on the wing, leading edge. So, with any luck, hit barrage balloon wires, the wire cutters would get you out of difficulty. So, by the Mark III, the Wellington really had reached the peak. It could not be improved any further at this stage. So the Mark IV prototype, 1 built, 220 built. You'll see here Pratt & Whitney double wasp engines. I'll correct myself from an earlier video I did on the Vickers bombers here. It wasn't the R2800, the 46 litre 18 cylinder twin wasp. It was the R1830, the 14 cylinder twin row double wasp. Now, why the change of engines to an American engine? Airframe production was far exceeding engine production, so it was a case of whatever you had around. Now, initially, there was talk of putting Alfa Romeo engines in it. The problem with this was by now, at this stage, Anglo-Italian relationships were getting what we can only describe as a little bit tense. There was talk about putting the Wright Cyclone 1820 engine in it. Then, it was indeed proposed to put the R2800, the 46 litre Pratt & Whitney double wasp in, but then in the end it went to the 1830, the 30 litre Pratt & Whitney double wasp that went into all the Mark IVs built. The Mark IV prototype, R1220, was actually lost in an accident over Addlestone, just down the road from here in Surrey. And another big difference with the Mark IVs were the turrets again, either the FN20A 4-gun rear or the 120 or 121 Fraser-Nash turrets, 4-gun again, that were fitted to this particular model, depending on what was available. And when I mention turrets, I'm broadly speaking, there were a lot of cases where it's whatever's available. You'll see here Mark Vs and Mark VIs, but these were pressurised, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to lump those into episode one after next of the specials. But in the meantime, let's go on to the rather prickly subject of the Mark VII. 300 ordered, intended as an improved Mark II. But there were none, the whole order was actually cancelled. There was one Wellington, built to Mark VII spec. This was a 1C, taken off the production line and converted to Mark II. It was re-registered from W6352, I believe it was, to T2545. Now this was the one that was then given to Rolls-Royce to develop the Merlin 60 engines. The other one I've seen touted as a Mark VII is the special Wellington with the 40mm dorsal cannon. That was a purely experimental one-off, and it was actually the Mark II prototype L4250 that was used for that, and it was never designated a Mark VII. And from there, I said by the time it got to the Mark III, it couldn't be developed any further. But fortunately, along comes our friend DTD again. 646. This was a lightweight aluminium alloy that was a similar strength to mild steel. So with the very simple task of swapping out any mild steel components for this new aluminium alloy, the weight of the aircraft could be considerably reduced. So in the 10, the Wellington taken another step forward, and this time to its ultimate development. The Mk10 production, 3,803 built in total. Bristol Hercules 18 engines, Fraser-Nash 5 front, Fraser-Nash 20A, 120 or 121 rear. And that brings us, for today, to the end of the bombers. The next episode, I'll be covering all the maritime versions, so I hope you can join me for that. Look forward to seeing you then. So the Mark II, we mentioned the Merlin engine. Here we have a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. V12, 27 litre. This is a Merlin 61. The Merlin that I mentioned on the Mark II Wellingtons was actually a Merlin 10, but in appearance, you'd be hard pressed to tell them apart. So here we have the Bristol Hercules, the most common engine used on the Wellingtons. 2 rows of 7, so a 14-cylinder, air-cooled, radial engine, 38.7 litres capacity, designed by Roy Fedden, very shortly afterwards Sir Roy Fedden, and it's the sleeve valve engine. So instead of having your reciprocating overhead valves, or poppets as they were termed, you've got the holes cut in the sleeves there for your inlet and exhaust ports. And you won't be able to see it around here, but there's a beautiful flame damping exhaust on the side there, basically so you couldn't be spotted by night fighters. So there we have the most common engine used on the Wellington.